before humans, before civilization, before even the dinosaurs. Earth was alive in ways you could never imagine. Volcanoes, supercontinents, alien-looking creatures. What did our world look like before we arrived? Stay curious, because I'll tell you what happened over 4.5 billion years ago. Our planet began its existence, not as the serene blue marble we know today, but as a hellish ball of molten rock spinning through the cosmic void. This was Earth in its infancy, a world so alien and hostile that it would be unrecognizable to modern eyes. The surface was a churning sea of lava, constantly bombarded by asteroids and comets, in what scientists call the Late Heavy Bombardment. These cosmic projectiles crashed into the molten surface with such frequency and violence that the entire planet remained in a state of perpetual chaos, more resembling the surface of a star than anything we might call home. During this primordial epoch, there were no oceans to speak of, no continents rising majestically from the waves, no familiar geographical features whatsoever. The landscape was dominated entirely by volcanic activity, on a scale that dwarfs anything in recorded human history. Massive volcanic eruptions sent plumes of gas and debris high into the thin atmosphere, while rivers of lava carved temporary channels across the surface before cooling and being replaced by new flows. The air itself was toxic, filled with sulfur compounds, methane, ammonia, and water vapor, but completely devoid of the oxygen that would later become essential for complex life. But within this apparent chaos, something truly remarkable was beginning to unfold. As the bombardment from space gradually decreased, and the planet's surface began to cool ever so slightly, the water vapor that had been trapped in the atmosphere from countless volcanic eruptions began to condense. What followed was perhaps the most extraordinary weather event in Earth's history. It began to rain, and it continued raining for thousands upon thousands of years. This wasn't the gentle precipitation we experience today, but torrential downpours that lasted for millennia, gradually filling the lowest points on the planet's surface and creating the first primitive oceans. The formation of these early oceans marked a crucial turning point in Earth's development. As water accumulated in vast basins, it began to moderate the planet's temperature through evaporation and condensation cycles. The water also served as a medium for chemical reactions that would prove essential for the eventual emergence of life. Minerals dissolved from the rocky surface, creating a complex chemical soup that would serve as the foundation for biological processes still billions of years in the future. During this period, Earth's atmosphere bore no resemblance to the life-sustaining envelope of gases we breathe today. The sky was not blue. It may have appeared orange, pink, or even a sickly yellow-green, depending on the concentration of various gases and particles suspended in the air. The sun, though present, would have been dimmer than it is today, providing perhaps 30% less energy to the planet's surface. Yet despite this reduced solar input, Earth remained hot, due to the greenhouse effect created by the thick atmosphere rich in carbon dioxide and water vapor. One of the most striking differences between this ancient Earth and our modern world was the position and appearance of the Moon. Our celestial companion was much closer to Earth in those days, perhaps only half the distance it maintains today. This proximity had profound effects on the planet's behavior. The gravitational pull of the nearby Moon created tides of incredible magnitude. Imagine walls of water hundreds of feet high sweeping across the primitive continents twice each day. These massive tides played a crucial role in mixing the early oceans, and may have helped concentrate the organic compounds that would eventually give rise to life. The day itself was dramatically different as well. Due to the Moon's gravitational influence and the planet's faster rotation, a day on early Earth lasted only about 6 hours. The planet spun rapidly on its axis, creating a world where the cycle of day and night passed in what would seem like a frantic blur to modern observers. This rapid rotation also contributed to the planet's dynamic weather patterns, generating powerful storms and wind systems that helped distribute heat and moisture around the globe. As millions of years passed, the planet gradually began to settle into a more stable configuration. The crust started to solidify and thicken, creating the first stable landmasses. These early continents were small and constantly shifting as the underlying mantle continued to churn and move. Volcanic activity, while still intense by modern standards, became more localized and less catastrophic. The atmosphere slowly began to clear as water vapor condensed into the oceans and volcanic dust settled out of the air. This was Earth's violent and chaotic beginning, a world of fire and steam, of cosmic bombardment and endless rain, of alien skies and impossible tides. Yet within this seemingly hostile environment, the stage was being set for one of the universe's most remarkable experiments: the emergence of life itself. The chemical ingredients were mixing in the early oceans, energy sources were abundant, and the planet was beginning its long journey toward becoming the vibrant, living world that would eventually give rise to forests, animals, and ultimately, conscious beings capable of looking back and marveling at their own origins. Around 3.8 billion years ago, in the depths of Earth's primitive oceans, something extraordinary occurred that would forever change the trajectory of our planet's history. The first signs of life appeared not as the complex, multicellular organisms we might imagine, but as incredibly simple, single-celled entities that were barely more than organized collections of organic molecules. These earliest life forms, known as, were so fundamentally different from modern life that they might as well have been aliens visiting from another world. These primordial organisms were remarkably hardy and adaptable, thriving in conditions that would instantly kill any modern life form. They made their homes in the scalding waters near underwater volcanic vents, where temperatures soared well above the boiling point of water, and the chemical environment was so extreme that it would dissolve most materials we consider durable today. Some of these early microbes fed on sulfur compounds spewing from the vents, while others derived energy from the breakdown of organic molecules that had formed through chemical processes in the early oceans. What makes this period so fascinating is the sheer duration of microbial dominance. These simple, single-celled organisms ruled Earth for nearly 2 billion years, a span of time so vast that it encompasses almost half of our planet's entire history. During this enormous epoch, they were the only form of life on Earth, quietly going about their business of survival and reproduction. While the planet continued to evolve around them, they witnessed the formation and destruction of countless survived ice ages and periods of intense volcanic activity, and gradually began to transform the very chemistry of the planet itself. The early prokaryotes were incredibly diverse in their survival strategies. Some were anaerobic, meaning they thrived in environments completely devoid of oxysquish, since oxygen didn't exist in Earth's atmosphere at this time. Others were chemosynthetic, deriving energy from chemical reactions involving sulfur, iron, or other minerals. Still, others developed the remarkable ability to harness the energy of sunlight through primitive forms of photosynthesis. Though these early photosynthetic processes were quite different from those used by modern plants, the oceans of this era were vastly different from today's seas. They were rich in dissolved iron, giving them a distinctive greenish or reddish tint that would have made them appear almost alien to modern eyes. The water was also much more acidic, and contained high concentrations of sulfur compounds and other chemicals that would be toxic to most contemporary life forms. Yet within this harsh environment, the early microbes not only survived, but gradually spreading to every available niche in the marine ecosystem. As these organisms evolved and diversified, some began to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of capturing and using energy. The most significant breakthrough came with the evolution of cyanobacteria, often called blue-green algae, though they were actually bacteria rather than true algae. These remarkable organisms developed a form of photosynthesis that was revolutionary in its implications. They could use sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into organic compounds, releasing oxygen as a waste product. At first, this oxygen production seemed insignificant. The gas was immediately absorbed by dissolved iron in the oceans, forming iron oxide compounds that settled to the ocean floor. These deposits, known as banded iron formations, can still be found in ancient rock layers today, serving as a geological record of this crucial period in Earth's history for hundreds of millions of years. This process continued, with cyanobacteria steadily producing oxygen that was just as steadily consumed by chemical reactions in the oceans. But around 2.5 billion years ago, something remarkable happened. The iron in the oceans became saturated, unable to absorb any more oxygen. For the first time in Earth's history, free oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere. This event, known as the Great Oxygenation Event or the Oxygen Catastrophe, represents one of the most dramatic environmental changes in our planet's history. The introduction of oxygen into Earth's atmosphere was both a blessing and a catastrophe, depending on your perspective. For the anaerobic organisms that had dominated life for nearly 2 billion years, oxygen was a deadly poison. Many species went extinct as their oxygen-free environments disappeared. The atmosphere itself changed color as oxygen reacted with methane and other gases, gradually transforming from its previous hues to something more recognizable to modern eyes. However, this atmospheric revolution also opened up entirely new possibilities for life. Oxygen is an incredibly efficient source of energy for biological processes, and organisms that could harness its power had access to far more energy than their anaerobic predecessors. This abundance of energy would eventually make possible the evolution of larger, more complex cells and, ultimately, multicellular life. The Great Oxygenation Event also had profound effects on Earth's climate and geology. Oxygen in the atmosphere began to form ozone, creating a protective layer that shielded the planet's surface from harmful ultraviolet radiation. This made it possible for life to eventually venture into shallower waters and, much later, onto land itself. The increased oxygen levels also affected the planet's temperature, as oxygen reacted with methane in the atmosphere, reducing the greenhouse effect and potentially contributing to one of Earth's earliest ice ages. During this transformative period, the continents were still small and constantly shifting. The supercontinent cycles that would later play such important roles in Earth's history were just beginning, with small landmasses occasionally colliding and separating in an endless dance of geological change. The oceans dominated the planet even more completely than they do today, covering perhaps 90% of the surface. Life during this era was entirely aquatic and microscopic, yet it was laying the groundwork for everything that would follow. The chemical processes developed by these early organisms, photosynthesis, cellular respiration, DNA replication, would become the fundamental building blocks of all future life. The oxygen they produced would make possible the evolution of complex, multicellular organisms, and their success in colonizing every available marine environment demonstrated life's remarkable ability to adapt and thrive under even the most challenging conditions. This was the age of the invisible, the microscopic rulers of a world in transition. For nearly 2 billion years, these simple organisms were the sole inhabitants of Earth, quietly transforming the planet's chemistry and atmosphere. while preparing the stage for the explosion of complex life that would eventually follow. Their legacy lives on in every breath we take and every cell in our bodies, a testament to the profound impact that even the simplest forms of life can have on the world around them. As we leap forward through the vast corridors of geological time to approximately 600 million years ago, we encounter an Earth that was beginning to stir with new forms of life that would have seemed utterly alien to the microscopic world that had dominated for so long. This was the Ediacaran period, named after the Ediacara Hills in South Australia, where some of the first fossils from this era were discovered. The planet was entering a phase of biological experimentation that would set the stage for one of the most dramatic evolutionary events in Earth's history. The Ediacaran world was a place of strange beauty and mystery. The ocean floors, which had been dominated by bacterial mats and simple microbial communities for billions of years, were now carpeted with an extraordinary array of soft-bodied organisms that defied easy categorization. These creatures, known collectively as the Ediacaran biota, represented Earth's first attempt at complex, multicellular life, and they were unlike anything that exists today. Imagine diving into these ancient seas and encountering organisms that looked more like abstract art than recognizable animals. Some resembled giant fronds swaying in the current, reaching heights of up to 6 feet and anchored to the seafloor by holdfast structures. Others appeared as circular discs with intricate patterns radiating from their centers, like living mandalas scattered across the ocean bottom. Still others took the form of quilted mattresses or segmented tubes, their surfaces covered with complex geometric patterns that hint at internal structures we can barely comprehend. What made these Ediacaran organisms so remarkable was not just their size. Some were among the largest life forms Earth had ever seen, but their fundamental strangeness. They had no eyes, no mouths, no obvious sensory organs, and no hard parts, like shells or bones. Many appear to have absorbed nutrients directly through their skin, like living sponges filtering the surrounding water. Some may have harbored symbiotic bacteria that provided energy through photosynthesis, making them part animal, part live-in solar panel. The most famous of these creatures was Dickinsonia, a flat, oval-shaped organism that could grow to over 3 feet in length. Its body was divided into segments, but unlike the segments of modern animals, these divisions seemed to serve no obvious functional purpose. Dickinsonia appears to have moved slowly across the seafloor, possibly feeding on bacterial mats, leaving behind fossilized tracks that represent some of the earliest evidence of animal locomotion on Earth. Another enigmatic resident of the Ediacaran seas was Charnia, the frond-like organism that was actually the first Ediacaran fossil ever discovered. Standing tall on the ocean floor like an underwater tree, Charnia had a complex branching structure that maximized its surface area for nutrient absorption, yet it had no mouth, no digestive system, and no obvious way of processing food other than passive absorption from the surrounding water. These organisms thrived in a world that was still fundamentally different from our own. The oceans contained less oxygen than they do today, and the chemistry of seawater was dominated by different dissolved minerals and compounds. The continents were still relatively small and barren, with no plants or animals to colonize the land. Life remained entirely aquatic, but it was beginning to experiment with new forms of organization and complexity that would prove crucial for future evolution. The Ediacaran period lasted for approximately 90 million years, during which these soft-bodied communities flourished and diversified, but their reign was not destined to last. Around 540 million years ago, the Ediacaran world came to an abrupt end, and Earth entered what paleontologists call the Cambrian period. What happened next would revolutionize life on our planet in ways that still echo through every ecosystem today. The transition from the Ediacaran to the Cambrian marked the beginning of what is arguably the most important evolutionary event in Earth's history, the Cambrian explosion. In geological terms, this explosion occurred with breathtaking speed, unfolding over just 20 to 25 million years, mere blink of an eye in the context of Earth's 4.5 billion-year history. Yet in that brief span, life underwent a transformation so radical and comprehensive that it fundamentally altered the trajectory of biological evolution. The Cambrian explosion was characterized by the rapid appearance of animals with hard shells, complex eyes, jointed legs, sophisticated nervous systems, and predatory behaviors. For the first time in Earth's history, organisms began to develop armor, weapons, and sensory systems that allowed them to actively hunt, defend themselves, and navigate their environment with unprecedented precision. This was the dawn of the modern animal kingdom, the period when most of the major groups of animals we recognize today first appeared in the fossil record. One of the most successful groups to emerge during this time was the trilobites, arthropods that would go on to dominate marine ecosystems for the next 270 million years. These remarkable creatures had compound eyes that could detect polarized light, jointed legs that allowed them to walk, swim, and burrow, and segmented bodies that could be modified for different functions. Some trilobites were tiny scavengers, no bigger than a pillbug, while others grew to enormous sizes, with some species reaching lengths of over 2 feet. The Cambrian seas were also home to Anomalocaris, one of the first large predators in Earth's history. This bizarre creature could grow to over 6 feet in length and possessed grasping arms lined with spines for capturing prey, along with a circular mouth filled with sharp teeth. Anomalocaris represented a new kind of organism, an active hunter that could pursue and capture other animals, fundamentally changing the dynamics of marine ecosystems. Other remarkable Cambrian creatures included Opabinia, with its 5 mushroom-shaped eyes and bizarre proboscis tipped with a grasping claw, Wiwaxia, covered in protective spines and scales, and Hallucigenia, originally reconstructed upside down by paleontologists because its anatomy was so unlike anything alive today. These organisms, preserved in exceptional detail in fossil deposits like the Burgess Shale in Canada, provide us with a window into a world of evolutionary experimentation that produced forms of life both familiar and utterly alien. The Cambrian explosion was driven by several factors that came together in a perfect storm of evolutionary innovation. Rising oxygen levels in the oceans provided the energy necessary for more active lifestyles and complex metabolisms. The development of predation created an evolutionary arms race, with prey species evolving defensive adaptations, while predators developed increasingly sophisticated hunting strategies. The evolution of eyes allowed organisms to detect food, predators, and mates from a distance, opening up new ecological niches and behaviors. Perhaps most importantly, this period saw the evolution of developmental genes that could control the formation of complex body plans. These genetic toolkits allowed organisms to experiment with new forms of organization, creating the basic blueprints for segmented bodies, jointed appendages, and specialized organ systems that would characterize animal life for hundreds of millions of years to come. During this remarkable period, Earth's continents were still largely barren and lifeless. The land was dominated by rocky surfaces, primitive soils, and occasional mats of algae or bacteria near water sources. There were no forests, no grasslands, no terrestrial animals of any kind. The drama of the Cambrian explosion played out entirely in the oceans, where life was experimenting with new forms of complexity, organization that would eventually make the colonization of land possible. The legacy of the Cambrian explosion cannot be overstated. This brief period of intense evolutionary innovation established the basic body plans and ecological relationships that would characterize animal life for the remainder of Earth's history. The eyes that first evolved in Cambrian arthropods would eventually give rise to the visual systems of the jointed appendages of early arthropods would be modified into the wings of insects and the limbs of the predator-prey relationships that first emerged in Cambrian seas would drive evolutionary innovation for hundreds of millions of years to come. As the Cambrian period drew to a close, Earth had been transformed from a world of simple, soft-bodied organisms into a complex ecosystem teeming with armored early vertebrates and a bewildering array of experimental life forms. The stage was now set for life's next great adventure, the colonization of land itself. Around 470 million years ago, Earth stood on the brink of another revolutionary transformation that would rival the Cambrian explosion in its significance for the future of life on our planet. For over 3 billion years, life had been confined entirely to aquatic environments, with the vast continental land masses remaining as barren and lifeless as the surface of Mars. But now, driven by evolutionary pressures and new opportunities, life was about to take its first tentative steps onto dry land, beginning a conquest that would ultimately transform the entire planet. The transition from water to land represented one of the most challenging evolutionary hurdles life has ever faced. Aquatic organisms had evolved in an environment where water provided structural support, protection from temperature fluctuations, a medium for reproduction, and a constant supply of dissolved nutrients and oxygen. Land, by contrast, was a harsh and unforgiving environment where organisms had to support their own weight against gravity, protect themselves from desiccation and temperature extremes, find new ways to reproduce without water, and develop entirely new methods for obtaining nutrients and oxygen. The first pioneers in this terrestrial adventure were not animals, but plants. Simple green algae that had been living in shallow coastal waters began to develop adaptations that allowed them to survive brief periods of exposure to air during low tides. Over millions of years, these adaptations became more sophisticated, eventually giving rise to the first true land plants around 450 million years ago. These early terrestrial plants were nothing like the towering trees and colorful flowers we associate with plant life today. They were small, simple organisms that looked more like modern mosses or liverworts, lacking true roots, stems, or leaves. Instead, they had primitive structures called rhizoids that anchored them to the substrate and absorbed water and nutrients from the surrounding environment. They reproduced through spores rather than seeds, and they required moist conditions to complete their life cycles. Despite their humble appearance, these pioneering plants began to transform the terrestrial environment in profound ways. Their rhizoids and primitive root systems began to break down rock surfaces, creating the first primitive soils. Their photosynthetic activities pumped oxygen into the atmosphere while removing carbon dioxide, gradually altering the planet's atmospheric composition. Most importantly, they began to create the foundation for terrestrial food webs by converting sunlight and atmospheric carbon dioxide into organic compounds that could support other forms of life. As plant communities became established on land, they underwent rapid evolutionary diversification. Simple mosses gave way to more complex forms with primitive, vascular systems that could transport water and nutrients more efficiently. These early vascular plants, such as Cooksonia, were still small and simple, but they represented a crucial step toward the development of larger, more complex plant forms. The evolution of vascular systems was a game-changing innovation that allowed plants to grow taller and colonize environments farther from water sources. with specialized tissues for transporting water from roots to leaves, and organic compounds from leaves to roots, plants could begin to exploit the three-dimensional space above the ground surface. This led to an evolutionary arms race for sunlight, with plants competing to grow taller and shade out their competitors. By the Devonian period, around 400 million years ago, the first forests were beginning to appear on Earth's continents. These ancient woodlands were dominated by primitive trees such as oak, which could grow to heights of over 100 feet, and possessed some of the first true wood in Earth's history. Other common plants included giant ferns, horsetails, and club mosses that created dense, humid forest environments. Unlike anything that exists today, the colonization of land by plants created entirely new ecological opportunities for other forms of life. Where plants went, animals inevitably followed, drawn by the abundant food sources and new habitats that terrestrial plant communities provided. The first animals to make the transition to land were arthropods, or relatives of modern insects, spiders, and crustaceans that were already well adapted for life in challenging environments. These early terrestrial arthropods included primitive millipedes and centipedes that fed on decaying plant material and smaller organisms in the soil. Some of these creatures grew to enormous sizes in the oxygen-rich atmosphere of the Devonian period. Arthropleura, a giant millipede-like creature, could reach lengths of over 8 feet, making it one of the largest land animals of its time. These massive arthropods played crucial roles in early terrestrial ecosystems, breaking down plant material and cycling nutrients through the soil. Spiders and their relatives also made early appearances on land, developing sophisticated hunting strategies and web-building behaviors that allowed them to exploit the growing populations of flying insects. The evolution of flight in insects during this period opened up entirely new ecological niches and created complex three-dimensional food webs that extended from the forest floor to the canopy. But perhaps the most significant evolutionary development of this period was the emergence of vertebrates capable of surviving on land. The Devonian period is often called the Age of Fishes, because of the remarkable diversity of fishes that evolved during this time. Many of these fish developed increasingly sophisticated adaptations for life in shallow, oxygen-poor waters, including primitive lungs that allowed them to extract oxygen directly from the air. Some fish began to develop muscular, lobed fins that could support their weight and allow them to move across land for short distances. These lob-finned fish, such as Tiktaalik, represent crucial transitional forms between purely aquatic vertebrates and the first amphibians. Tiktaalik possessed a mixture of fish and amphibian characteristics, including gills and scales like a fish, but also a neck, robust ribs, and limb-like fins that could support its weight on land. The evolution of amphibians from lobe-finned fish represented one of the most important transitions in vertebrate evolution. Early amphibians, such as Acanthostega and Echitheostega, were still heavily dependent on aquatic environments for reproduction and much of their adult lives, but they possessed 4 limbs with digits that allowed them to move effectively on land. These early tetrapods opened up entirely new ecological niches for vertebrates and set the stage for the evolution of reptiles, mammals, and birds. The Devonian period also witnessed dramatic changes in Earth's geography and climate that profoundly influenced the evolution and distribution of life. The continents were still in the process of assembling into larger landmasses, with collisions between continental plates creating mountain ranges and altering ocean currents. These geological processes affected global climate patterns, creating new environments and evolutionary pressures that drove the diversification of both plant and animal life. One of the most significant geographical features of this time was the formation of the supercontinent Gondwana in the southern hemisphere, which included what would later become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, and India. In the Northern Hemisphere, smaller continents such as Laurentia and Baltica were beginning to collide, creating the early stages of what would eventually become the supercontinent. These continental movements had profound effects on ocean circulation patterns and global climate. The formation of mountain ranges altered precipitation patterns and created rain shadows that influenced the distribution of plant communities. Changes in ocean currents affected the distribution of marine life and the exchange of nutrients between different ocean basins. The late Devonian period was marked by a series of extinction events that eliminated many marine species, particularly those adapted to warm, shallow seas. These extinctions may have been caused by climate change associated with the formation of changes in ocean chemistry, or impacts from extraterrestrial objects. However, terrestrial life was less severely affected, and the colonization of land continued to accelerate. By the end of the Devonian period, Earth's continents were no longer barren wastelands, but were instead covered with extensive forests and populated by a diverse array of early amphibians and other terrestrial organisms. The foundation had been laid for the explosive diversification of terrestrial life that would characterize the following Carboniferous period. The conquest of land by life represents one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of evolution. In the span of just a few tens of millions of years, organisms that had been confined to aquatic environments for over 3 billion years successfully adapted to the challenges of terrestrial life and began to transform the continents into the complex, interconnected ecosystems we recognize today. This transition set the stage for all subsequent evolution of terrestrial life, from the great forests of the Carboniferous to the age of dinosaurs to the eventual emergence of mammals, and ultimately human civilization itself. As Earth transitioned into the Carboniferous period, roughly 360 million years ago, our planet was about to witness one of the most spectacular and transformative chapters in its biological history. This was an era when life on land would reach new heights of diversity and complexity, creating ecosystems so lush and productive that their remains would literally fuel human civilization hundreds of millions of years later in the form of coal deposits that still power our world today. The Carboniferous period, which lasted for approximately 60 million years, was characterized by a unique combination of environmental conditions that created a perfect storm for biological productivity. Global temperatures were warm and stable, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were high, and most importantly, oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere reached levels never seen before or since in Earth's history. At times during the Carboniferous, oxygen made up as much as 35% of the atmosphere, compared to the 21% we breathe today. This oxygen-rich environment would have profound effects on the evolution and ecology of terrestrial life. The most visible and dramatic consequence of these conditions was the development of vast forests that covered much of the available land surface. These were not forests as we know them today, dominated by flowering plants and conifers, but rather alien-looking woodlands, composed of giant versions of plants that exist today only as small, humble representatives of once mighty lineage. Towering club mosses, some reaching heights of over 130 feet, formed the canopy of these ancient forests. These giants, with names like Lepidodendron and Sigillaria, had thick, bark-covered trunks marked with distinctive diamond-shaped scars where leaves had been attached. Beneath the canopy of giant club mosses, the forest floor was dominated by enormous ferns and horsetails that created a dense, humid understory. Some of these ferns, such as Ceronius, grew as tall as modern trees, with trunks supported by masses of adventitious roots that formed a complex, buttressed base. The horsetails, relatives of the small equisetum plants found in modern wetlands, grew to heights of 60 feet or more, their jointed stems and whorled branches creating an almost bamboo-like appearance. These Carboniferous forests were fundamentally different from modern ecosystems in ways that went far beyond their unusual plant composition. The trees and large plants of this era had not yet evolved sophisticated wood decay mechanisms, meaning that when they died, their massive trunks and branches accumulated on the forest floor, rather than being rapidly decomposed by bacteria and fungi over millions of years. These accumulated plant remains were buried under sediments and compressed into the coal seams that would later become so important to human industrial development. The forest floor of the Carboniferous was a wonderland of decomposing plant material, creating a rich environment for the arthropods that had colonized land during the previous Devonian period. But the high oxygen levels of the Carboniferous atmosphere allowed these arthropods to grow to sizes that would be impossible in today's world. Oxygen diffuses into arthropod tissues through a system of tubes called trachea, and the efficiency of this system limits how large these animals can grow. In the oxygen-rich Carboniferous atmosphere, these constraints were relaxed, allowing arthropods to reach truly gigantic proportions. The most famous of these giant arthropods was Meganeura, a dragonfly-like insect with a wingspan that could exceed 2.5 feet. These enormous predators patrolled the Carboniferous skies, hunting smaller insects with the same efficiency as modern dragonflies, but on a scale that would have made them formidable predators capable of taking prey as large as small. Their compound eyes, some as large as human fists, could track movement across the forest canopy with remarkable precision. On the forest floor, equally impressive giants scuttled through the leaf litter. Arthropleura, the giant millipede mentioned earlier, reached its peak during the Carboniferous, with some specimens growing to lengths of over 8 feet and widths of nearly 2 feet. These massive herbivores fed on the abundant plant material covering the forest floor, their powerful mandibles capable of processing even tough, woody stems and roots. Equally impressive were the giant centipedes of the Carboniferous, some reaching lengths of 6 feet or more. Unlike their modern relatives, which are typically small predators of insects and other tiny prey, these ancient giants were capable of hunting vertebrates, including early amphibians and reptiles. Their powerful legs and venomous bites made them apex predators in the terrestrial ecosystems of their time. The abundance of giant arthropods created complex food webs that supported an increasingly diverse array of vertebrate life. Amphibians continued to diversify and adapt to terrestrial environments, with some species growing to enormous sizes. Eriops, a crocodile-like amphibian, could reach lengths of 15 feet and possessed powerful jaws lined with sharp teeth for capturing fish arthropods and smaller amphibians. But perhaps the most significant evolutionary development of the Carboniferous period was the emergence and diversification of reptiles, the first vertebrates to become truly independent of aquatic environments for reproduction. Unlike amphibians, which still required water for their larval stages, reptiles evolved the ability to lay eggs with protective shells that could develop on land. This innovation, known as the amniotic egg, freed reptiles from the need to return to water for reproduction and allowed them to colonize environments that were inaccessible to amphibians. Early reptiles, such as Hylonomus, were small, lizard-like creatures that fed primarily on insects and other small arthropods. These pioneering reptiles possessed several key adaptations that made them superior to amphibians in terrestrial environments. Their skin was covered with scales that prevented water loss. Their kidneys were more efficient at conserving water, and their eggs could be laid in dry environments without desiccating. The evolution of reptiles during the Carboniferous set the stage for one of the most important radiations in vertebrate history. From these humble beginnings, reptiles would eventually give rise to dinosaurs, birds, mammals, and all other major groups of terrestrial vertebrates. The amniotic egg that first evolved in Carboniferous reptiles would prove to be one of the most important innovations in the history of life on land. The Carboniferous period also witnessed significant changes in Earth's geography and climate that influenced the evolution and distribution of life. The assembly of the supercontinent Pangaea was well underway, with major continental collisions creating mountain ranges such as the Appalachians in North America and the Hercynian Mountains in Europe. These geological events had profound effects on global climate patterns and the distribution of terrestrial ecosystems. The formation of Pangaea also led to changes in ocean circulation patterns that affected global climate. As the continents came together, the vast Panthalassic Ocean that surrounded Pangaea became increasingly isolated from the smaller Tethys Sea that separated the northern and southern parts of the sea. These changes in ocean circulation contributed to the gradual cooling and drying of global climate that would characterize the later part of the Carboniferous period. The late Carboniferous also saw the evolution of the first conifers, early relatives of modern pine, fir, and spruce trees. These plants possessed several advantages over the giant club, mosses, and ferns that had dominated earlier Carboniferous forests. Conifers had more efficient vascular systems, better drought-tolerant, and more sophisticated reproductive strategies that allowed them to colonize drier environments. As global climate became cooler and more seasonal toward the end of the Carboniferous, conifers began to replace the giant lycopsids in many environments. The transition from the lush, swampy forests of the early Carboniferous to the more seasonal, conifer-dominated ecosystems of the late Carboniferous marked the beginning of a major ecological shift that would continue into the following Permian period. So, did you survive that journey through time? Before dinosaurs, before us, Earth was a world of chaos, creativity, and constant change. And it's still changing. Follow Al, tell you what happened to uncover the forgotten stories buried in time. Because every rock, every fossil, and every layer of Earth has a tale to tell.